Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by what was formerly known when we had a physical office as the Ministry of Truth, and that is Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you?
Hello, Nick. How's it going?
Very good. And Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
I'm good, Nick.
Right. So let us start off with our first story of today. And this is one that, how could we not talk about it? He's someone who's popped up for many controversies in the past, and he is a UCT lecturer, although apparently not a professor, called Lwazi Lushaba. And he lectures at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. He was caught on camera saying, quote, "Hitler committed no crime. All Hitler did was to do to white people what white people had normally reserved for black people." Now, that's what I call a hot take if ever there was one. This was criticized heavily by the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, who I think missed the point slightly because they seem to treat this as just a normal case of anti-Semitism, when actually it's a little bit more subtle than that, if equally insidious. He was criticized by the Jewish Board of Deputies. When asked for comment by the media, he said, "If you knew what university lecturers are, you wouldn't be asking me that question you are asking me." In the past, he's done various controversial things, which I'm sure we'll get into now. But Terence, what should we make of these comments? This is rather strange to hear in a university, or is it that strange to hear in a university?
Yes and no. I think that it's the sort of thing that surprises us, but when one reflects on it, it's not all that surprising. This sort of rhetoric that plumbs into sort of extreme race classification and ascribing to particular race groups, particular classifications would have been regarded as abhorrent 25 years ago. Now it is it's fairly commonplace. The influence of critical race theory and whatever, that sort of thing. Now we have these one respected journalist writing about how white people are, quote, biologically, unquote, programmed towards dominance. This is straight out of something that's older than or that goes beyond standard racial bigotry. You ascribe traits that almost seem to reside in a kind of genetic level. As far as the speaker goes, one Dr. Lwazi Lushaba, he's as you say, has popped up in a number of controversies. I gather that at one stage he set an exam question explaining, requiring students to explain the impossibility of friendship between black and white people. Once more, this is sort of racial determinism on steroids. But this is also the sort of logic that I think most sensible people will would reject instinctively. But appealing to his academic garments, he said, he said to a reporter, "Well, you wouldn't even ask this question if you knew what a university professor was." And unfortunately, he's probably onto something there. That universities have become a space where enormously reckless and self-indulgent ideological fixations will be indulged in a way that they are unlikely to be in the real world. No matter how much ordinary people outside that environment may feel that they also have comparable grievances. For me, though, on his exact words, was the comment, "Hitler committed no crime." He's not saying, he's not saying, as some might try to defend him, that, well, this is the way white people behave, and therefore it's not exceptional. No. What he's saying is that this was not a crime. That sort of starts to lope into mass murder is in certain instances acceptable, and unfortunately there is also a tradition of that on extreme on political extremes that has been defended by society's intellectuals. Never ends well.
Indeed. I'm very disturbed with this kind of rhetoric, because his claim here, as far as I can work out, is that white people, as you said, there's this resurrection of this old scientific racism, that white people are programmed just to do sort of evil things. And, if white people are just essentially rabid dogs who can't help themselves but commit terrible atrocities against other races, what is the next logical step? What do you do with a rabid dog? And I think that's a very dark road that we head down. Marius, my question to you, firstly, just generally, what do you think about this? And secondly, as far as I can tell, based on what he said in the past, based on this comment, Dr. Lushaba or Mr. Lushaba is a racist, like completely, blatantly, openly, proudly a racist. Why is the university happy to keep him in their halls? They wouldn't accept this if it was a white person.
I think it's probably comes from that school of thought that says black people can't be racist because of power dynamics and whatever in South Africa, or globally actually. But as anybody who can think for 10 seconds can tell you that the belief that black people have absolutely no power in South Africa is, of course, nonsense. And that white people are the only people who have power is rubbish. Some black people have power, some black people don't. Some white people have power, some white people don't. And that's the thing, you've got to treat people as individuals. And that's, racism, we need to use its old definition, which is discriminate against people on the basis of race, not on depending on how much privilege they have or much power they have. But just when we talk about Dr. Lushaba, it also reminded me there was a guy called Thabo Dlamini. You guys might recognize the name. He was also quite involved in the Fees Must Fall at the same time as Dr. Lushaba was banned from. He was actually suspended, or I'm not sure if he was expelled, but he was suspended from BITS when he was busy doing his PhD there. And Thabo Dlamini said something similar. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, what Hitler did was actually a good thing, or something like that. So, the school of thought is probably not, it's not such a fringe theory, probably among some people in South Africa. But I think there's also, we were talking about it earlier this morning with some of our colleagues. And should Dr. Lushaba's right to say this, should we defend it as in terms of free speech? Or should we say, no, he's not allowed to say it? Or I think the question is, I do think he should be allowed to say this, but the question is, should he be allowed to say this as a university professor lecturing students? I think that's where it becomes a problem. And I think UCT, if they do decide to get rid of Dr. Lushaba, they could easily make a point. He can say whatever he likes, but in terms of freedom of association, do you want to be linked to somebody or associated with somebody who says vile things like this? And on a final point, on this, if Dr. Lushaba, what he says is that Hitler didn't commit a crime because what was done to white people, whites have been doing to black people for generations, whatever the case is, then any of the crimes that white people, speaking broadly, have committed, apartheid, colonialism, what happened in the Belgian Congo and so on, weren't crimes. And it's a ridiculous way of thinking. Also, it's this kind of belief that you get pure races and you get impure races, which is of course nonsense. People who we would think of as white have done terrible things since the dawn of civilization. People who we would think of as black have done terrible things. People would think of as Arabs or Indian, whatever the case is. There's no race on earth who we can't say people who would be considered the same race as me has not done something terrible at some point in history.
Right. I'm sure also that the Jewish Board of Deputies would make the argument that by saying that he's also, in a sense, really downplaying the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was a very specific thing that had a very mechanical, specific organization against peoples in Eastern Europe, Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, etc. That is not the same thing as colonial conquest and subjugation that carried on through the 19th century. And I think there is a point to be made there that to sort of conflate these two things together is actually, at the very best, callous, and at the very worst, sort of almost anti-Semitic. I mean, even in the Belgian Congo, which is possibly the worst example of colonialism, there were no gas chambers.
And also, I mean, probably the three worst examples of genocide post World War II. There wasn't white people doing anything to black people. It was, I mean, in the Muslims getting killed in Yugoslavia, there was whites versus whites. In Cambodia, I mean, that's easily the worst genocide since World War II. There was Cambodians doing it to each other. And then, of course, we had Rwanda, where there was Hutus and Tutsis. Right. But you'd probably get, people who would argue that is a legacy of European colonialism, because it was the Belgians who said these guys are Tutsis, these guys are Hutus, and treated Tutsis a bit better. And they actually, I mean, this is from what I've heard about Rwanda, there was no real Hutus and Tutsis didn't really exist as we perceive them now, but with the Belgian colonial administration, they, kind of co-opted Tutsis as the, administrators and what have you, and the Hutus were kind of the underclass, and that led to. But I mean, then we're also saying that the Rwandans had no agency with what happened in 1994, which is also, you can just blame it on the past. Which, I mean, of course, history has long tentacles, but people still have agency and can decide whether their actions are decided by history or by themselves.
Right. The other big genocide, of course, of the 20th century was the Armenian genocide, which often gets left out of these lists. Yeah. But anyway, Terence.
I was talking about post World War II there.
Right. Terence, any more thoughts on this?
Look, I would defend his right to say that, and I think that proving that there is some sort of
sorry, let me just stop you there. Both you and Marius have said you defend his right to say that. What do you mean specifically? Do you mean that the state shouldn't imprison him?
Yes. Look, I think it's a complex situation because it is on a university campus, and although the state of the academy has taken a turn for the worse, one must be very careful about how one addresses that. Now, I think that his sentiments are awful, and I feel that I think that he would have great difficulty actually justifying it logically with reference to history. But I think that a university should be an environment where particularly insane ideas can be floated, but one would hope that they would also be combated. The question is he as an academic open to being challenged and refuted? I don't know. I think that's an important point. The other thing, and I think this will come down to
his response to the media suggests perhaps not.
Perhaps not. Yes, and that to be in a university setting is possibly a more profound problem. That I am not setting before you ideas to debate, but the line which you must follow. Now, when he said that question about how blacks and whites can't be friends, it seemed that was the only argument you could take, and the instruction was to sort of demonstrate that you understand and agree with that. That's cultural revolution stuff, not academia. I think also, in terms of such defense as you might offer, or maybe as attorneys in the end, I don't think that in saying this he is calling for any sort of violence or for any sort of harm to anyone. I'm certainly not on the basis of what I've read. As far as the Jewish Board of Deputies go, look, they represent a particular constituency with particular sensitivities. That's part of living in a plural society. So yes, they will take more offense at this than they might take at something else. Just like I can understand why let's say economic freedom fighters would take more offense at an instance of anti-black racism. The question though, does the broad societal ship sail forward? Are there enough people to occupy some sort of middle ground that they can perhaps differentiate between defending the principle of someone being able to spout this and being susceptible to the message? And that applies again and again and again. It's essentially it raises the ghost of Adam Katsavelos and whatnot.
You also have to ask yourself, just as a counterfactual, say Lazi Lushaba was white and a member of, I don't know, of your Yech, and he was doing this kind of thing at and he was involved in violent protest attacks. What are the odds he would have got a lecturer position at UCT? If his name was actually Fred Fadamarva,
I think
said this kind of stuff, but
is the big issue here is that the university clearly doesn't have a consistent standard, because they would never keep on their payroll a lecturer who professed that black people were inherently, I don't know, some racial stereotype about black people, that they would like do predetermined
less evolved or something than white people or something,
or right, any kind of racist sentiment that would be as racist as what Lushaba has said. And if they wouldn't tolerate that from a white person, then they quite clearly should not tolerate it from a black lecturer either. If a student says that, it's one thing, but if a lecturer is holding this as his professed view and this is against the values of the university, then they should fire him. But anyway, let's go on to the next story, which is, I think, perhaps a much better one, and that is our colleague Anthea Jeffrey wrote an article which has been published on the dailyfriend.co.za, entitled "Employment or Expropriation Without Compensation? What do ordinary South Africans want?" So there's this constant, we talked about this before on the show, this constant drumbeat of, there's this great land hunger, that black people are crying out for land, and they if this is not satisfied, as Julius Malema once said in an interview, if black people aren't given land by the state according to our policies, then there will be genocide, basically was his claim. However, IRR surveys, which have been going on since 2001, have found consistently that when you actually ask black South Africans what their top priorities are, land reform is incredibly low on the list. About 3% of those surveyed said that in 2001 said that land reform was a big problem. This has been fairly consistent through all the years. In 2016, it was 0.5. In 2019, it was 2.8%. In 2020, it seemed to go up a bit to about 5%, but that also just could be noise in the data, or maybe because there was more rhetoric around this issue. But most black South Africans seem to be concerned with what really is the big problem, that's joblessness, with over 50% of black respondents saying in these surveys that they want more jobs as their top priority. Terence, you suggested this topic. Tell me what we should take away from this.
Well, look, South Africa is a rapidly urbanizing society, and unless you're going to do what Pol Pot did in Cambodia and try and force people out at gunpoint, once a population is urbanized, it doesn't generally go back. Modern life offers more rewards in an urban center. Now, when people hear the term land reform, they tend to associate it with agrarian life. Now, I think that one could possibly make an argument that land reform is a broader issue, and that when one talks about land reform, one's also talking about urban land, and perhaps that's not adequately captured. But the point is that this the idea that society will fall apart if there is not sort of massive race-based land transfer is not borne out by any data. And you don't have to listen to the IRR. You can look at Afrobarometer. Very similar results. The ANC's own polling doesn't show that there's a huge demand for this. I was told by a journalist who interviewed one of the one of the ANC's pollsters in 1994, and he asked him, why didn't you focus on the land question? He said, because we had daily polling data coming in and just never registered. The PAC, that was the entire campaign, and they got 0.5%. They got 0.5%. To the extent that there is a land question, it is far more about urban land and housing, but that's captured in the sort of teens teen level priority that you see people saying housing is their priority, and to outfit and plan a city properly in this day and age. This model that we have, we keep on expanding or whatever, that has to change. EWC or whatever is not the solution. You have to go up. That's why you have skyscrapers in all sort of functional cities where people can live close to jobs, opportunities, education, and that sort of thing. South Africa's problem, though, is that the economy is not competitive enough to generate those sort of things. So what you have is a population that wants inclusion in a modern employment-based consumer economy, and a political class that seems to do everything in its power to keep a great mass of that population excluded from those opportunities. And then it comes up with a sort of romantic, ideologically driven notion that we can create this sort of peasant economy, which our power brokers and academic proponents are very unlikely to want to accept for themselves. I remember a couple of years ago there was a piece, I think it was in the Mail and Guardian, by someone who had this plan where every South African would be given, I think, 2 hectares, no more, no less. They produce their own food, and we have this, bucolic rural Eden. This was a guy at Wits University. So I don't know. It seems to be, well, it's the rest of you plebs can go and hoe in the hot sun. I'll stay in my air-conditioned office and and discuss the philosophy of it. No, this is not a solution, and the problem is that it takes it distorts the potential of real agrarian reform. You and I interviewed a black farmer from the Eastern Cape who was bounced from farm to farm and evicted and whatever because someone was receiving bribes. Now this is a guy who actually wants to farm, was making a living, not spectacular, but he had his little place in the sun, and that was being ripped away from him. And in that sort of environment, it's just crazy to think that ever more power for government, ever thinner property protections for everyone else, will somehow result in anything other than a disaster.
Right. As I say over and over again, under EFF and radical ANC land reform policy, the number of black landowners will be reduced to 0 because no one will own land under, for example, the EFF's policy. Marius, what are your thoughts on this issue? Anything to add to what Terence has said?
Well, I think when Terence was talking about cities, I think he hit the nail on the head. South Africa's about 2/3 urbanized, a bit more actually, and that's gone up from only about half of South Africans were urbanized 30 years ago. So it shows people have been coming to cities, and I mean, this is not a uniquely South African phenomenon. People go to cities because of opportunities. There's a political scientist at Harvard, a guy called Ed Glaser, and he says cities are actually humanity's greatest invention. And I think I tend to agree with him. They're places where people can innovate together. And I mean, obviously, when you get the more brains together to come up with the solutions. I mean, one person thinking of a solution by themselves is probably not going to come to anything, but you put 20, not even clever people, just 20 people who think about things together, and they'll probably come up with a solution. And that's one of the, and that's cities in every country in the world. Cities are the engines of economic growth of a place, and South Africa's no exception. I think I'm open to correction, but I think Johannesburg alone accounts for about 20% of South Africa's economic output. And I think with the 3 big cities of Cape Town, Joburg, and Durban, I think it's close to 40%, but I'm also open to correction on that. So it just shows you how important cities are. And that's actually where we have to look at things like land reform, making sure that people are living in decent places, where there's running water, electricity, they're close to public transport or roads and close to job opportunities. I think that's an important thing. I mean, as Terence says, land reform is important, but I really think it's, I'm also very skeptical that there's this massive land hunger. And it's also, I think it's quite a paternalistic way of looking at people, because most people actually want the same thing. They want a decent place to live. They want to have some money to go on holiday every now and again, or, get out the city, to have a TV, send their kids to decent schools. They don't want to go live on some, godforsaken piece of land in the Northern Cape, trying to scrabble a living together out of 2 hectares and getting up at 4 a.m. to go milk their cows or, keep their chickens safe from a jackal or whatever the case is. I mean, that's for some people, but to become a farmer and to be a successful farmer, it's really hard work. And I think most people are like us, soft statsiapis or city slickers, happy to have a warm bed in your little garden in Joburg or whatever, and you have a job. And but I mean, I think this is a complex issue, but just shows you, I mean, polling, there's been no polling that I've seen, not just from us, but as Terence said, from Afrobarometer and others, where, land is this major issue. So, but I mean, also land is a very emotional issue. Even people who wouldn't want to go back to land are still it's because of the history of colonial and apartheid dispossession and so on. I mean, it's, it's not just a simple policy question. I mean, there are much deeper questions around it too.
Right. I think, though, that it is only academics and politicians who could believe that the vast majority of South African society is desperate to become a smallhold peasant farmer, as though we were still in the 19th century, and we were still facing that kind of world. But then again, a lot of them are adherents of a philosophy of the 19th century, which is, of course, Marxism. So maybe it's not completely out of character for them. Anyway, let's very briefly go over our last topic for today. Now, of course, we criticized the booze ban, the alcohol ban, when the government implemented it several times during lockdown. The alcohol industry has now pointed to a new study which has come out, which has done various methods to look at what the actual effect of the booze ban was, as opposed to other parts of the lockdown. At the time when the booze ban was tested out, there were reports of a 60% drop in trauma admissions at hospitals. However, this study claimed through the use of a model that this was more likely due to the curfew. And they also brought up several other counterfactual examples. The United Kingdom had a curfew but no alcohol ban and saw a similar drop in trauma admissions to hospitals at 57%. The US, 54%. Italy, 57%. Ireland, 62%. And Germany, 38%. None of those countries banned alcohol. So, Marius, what should we make of this very briefly in the last 60 seconds or so here?
Well, we discussed this before the show, and I think there is a case to be made when to restrict people's freedom. Is there? But when we're in this global pandemic and restrict, and it shows that there is kind of that curfews have worked. So perhaps it's but then it's also the question of should the government be telling people what to do, and. As I said before the show, trauma units are there to help people who've suffered trauma, whether that's their own fault from drinking too much and falling over, or whatever the case is. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm quite conflicted in this. I'm still not sure I agree with it.
Yeah, more likely stabbing each other while drunk.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think South Africans are more likely to stab each other than Irishmen, or Germans probably more likely to have fallen over and hit his head from too many Guinnesses or, lagers there in Munich or whatever the case is. So, yeah, this is it doesn't really surprise me. I didn't think the alcohol ban would make that much of a difference. And in South Africa, anyway, people who wanted to drink could still carry on drinking. And it's kind of a band-aid on a problem. So South Africa, we actually don't drink that much compared to other countries. But we in the top 50% or whatever. We don't drink as much as the Czechs or the Germans. We have much higher levels of interpersonal violence. And I think it's a much deeper issue than just because guys drink too much,
Yeah, and I think our culture of drinking is also worse. Like the Czechs, they drink lots of beer, but it's kind of, you have a beer with lunch, you have a beer with supper. You don't get blackout drunk every weekend when you go for a hard jaw.
Exactly, yeah. When you go to old Billy the Bums, you're looking for trouble in a bint,
Right, exactly. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We will see you next week for the next episode of the Daily Friend Show. We hope you enjoyed. Please like this video, share this podcast, do all those good things, and check out thedailyfriend.co.za. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.